Would Titanic survive a head-on collision with the iceberg? We will discuss this hypothetical situation in this video. Suppose Officer Murdoch sees the iceberg, the call comes in from the crow's nest, 6th Officer Moody picks up the phone, and in this time, in the few seconds that he has to make a decision, Officer Murdoch says, "We cannot avoid this iceberg, let's just drive into it." This is a very, very complex topic. There's so many variables and aspects at play here. The size, the position, the distance away from Titanic that the iceberg was, the amount of time that they had to react, and how they reacted and what they did to try to avoid the iceberg are all assumptions and massive subjects of debate. So let's define a few things before we continue. The basic question: would Titanic survive a head-on collision? The answer to this question can still be a no, and this can still be beneficial in terms of preservation of life. So Titanic sank in 160 minutes, and the key is here to increase the amount of time that it took for Titanic to sink so that Carpathia can arrive and rescue people. Thus the survival rate goes up. Of course, there's also the chance that Titanic doesn't sink at all after driving into the iceberg. Intuitively, whether you're on a bike, in a car, on a boat, or even in a tank, and there is a huge object in front of you, and you have time to turn, you're going to turn. So the idea of intentionally driving into the iceberg is insane, unless Officer Murdoch felt there was absolutely no chance of turning in time, which is unlikely, but it is possible. Also, in the event that they did intentionally just plow into this thing, and they survived, and they testified at the Mersey inquiry or whatever inquiry, Officer Murdoch's going to become Officer Murder. And there's likely going to be some severe legal repercussions. His career is going to be over, amongst many other issues. Several hundred people are likely going to die, mostly firemen and the men who work in the boiler rooms below the waterline towards the front of the ship, because that's the area, obviously, that's going to take all the damage. And there's going to be some very severe trauma, broken bones, head injuries to those that are lucky to survive. So it's not going to be a good situation regardless. Now we get into the details of a head-on collision. Firstly, who is to say that the collision that did occur was not basically a head-on collision? I'm not saying that Titanic didn't try to turn or evade this iceberg, but just because they tried doesn't mean that they actually significantly turned. Portions of this iceberg did fall onto the deck of Titanic, so it was obviously very close to a direct hit. It's quite possible that Titanic basically grounded partially on the underwater shelf of this iceberg, because if you remember, they have a significant volume underneath the water. So even if you were trying to drive directly into the spire of this iceberg, the underwater portion of it, which you can't see obviously, is going to deflect you to the left or the right. So a perpendicular collision might not even be possible, and you could just result in the double bottom of your ship just sort of bouncing along or on top of an underwater shelf of this iceberg, and it could rip out basically a significant portion of the entire bottom of the ship. You could rupture 10 watertight compartments, who knows, and the ship sinks very rapidly. Even modern icebreakers, extremely strong hulls, way stronger than Titanic's, they're still not designed to drive into icebergs. This is not how this works. Icebreakers don't break up icebergs. Modern, much smaller ships with welded steel hulls, which theoretically should be stronger than Titanic's, traveling less than a third of the speed that Titanic was, and they have a mass that's 1 to 2% of that of Titanic, so the amount of kinetic energy that they have relative to what Titanic had would be basically nothing. They still have sunk when they strike even small icebergs, or even growlers. And a good example of this would be the BCM Atlantic, which was a shrimping vessel that was only going like 6 to 7 knots, and the nature of how it struck the iceberg is unknown, but that's a fairly modern ship built in the 70s, I believe, if I recall correctly, and it still sank in a few hours. So I have a video on the BCM Atlantic, and I'll put the link in the description if you want to learn more about that. So, coming to a conclusion here, I guess, if I was absolutely forced to answer the question, would it have been beneficial for preserving lives to intentionally drive into this iceberg, I would say no. This is simply because of my experience as an engineer. Engineered parts or assemblies typically don't do well when they experience conditions that they're not designed for. And simply put, Titanic was not designed to collide and drive into icebergs. It's designed to see them and avoid them ahead of time. This is evident in the sense that they have multiple lookouts in multiple locations. They receive iceberg warnings through their new technology of a Marconi wireless system, and these notices are typically brought immediately to the bridge and given to the officers there. The officers discuss them, and then they put them in the chart room for everyone to review them. So it's obviously, this is a concerning thing. Icebergs in a known region that you're going to be traveling through is obviously a large concern. And Titanic designer Edward Wilding was also quoted at the Mersey inquiry saying, "We do not build ships to bang into stone walls or come into collisions." I could just agree with Edward Wilding when he stated that Titanic would stay afloat if intentionally just struck the iceberg head on, but I'm not going to. I think there's too many variables at play to really estimate that. I think there could be some issues that couldn't be anticipated, such as a watertight door or multiple being jammed open simply due to the damage that the ship took in the collision. I also think it's possible for a Titanic to capsize. So, obviously he could be right. Who knows? There's just too many things to really account for here. I think if you had 100 Titanics and drove them into the iceberg 100 times intentionally, I would think the amount of lives lost is more 60 times out of 100. And I think there is a possibility that the ship could sink very quickly in some cases, and the mortality rate could be near 100%. This is just my opinion. Obviously, this is an extremely complex question, and no one can really say with certainty how it'll go either way, because there's just too many variables at play here. So I could be totally wrong, and I'd be totally okay with that if somehow somebody could prove this one way or the other, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. So, bottom line is you cannot drive a 100 million pound object that is Titanic into a 2 billion with a B pound object, which is quite possibly what this iceberg's mass or weight could have been. Especially if you're traveling 22 knots, there's just absolutely no way this is going to end well for you. So, that's it. Thanks for watching.